When the heavy oak gavel slammed down, the entire Oak Haven town hall erupted in mocking, unapologetic laughter. Clara Hayes had just spent her last $800, her emergency winter grocery fund. Not on winter wheat, not on a working tractor, but on a collapsed, rat-infested brick building that the county had condemned 2 decades ago. The local agricultural barons wiped tears of mirth from their eyes. They thought she was a desperate, foolish girl digging her own financial grave. They had no idea she was about to turn that pile of rubble into a multi-million-dollar culinary empire. The Oak Haven County Courthouse in Oregon's Willamette Valley smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and generations of localized greed. It was the second Tuesday in October, the day of the annual tax lien auction, where the misfortunes of broken farmers were sold off to the highest bidder. Clara Hayes sat in the third row, her hands tightly gripping a battered leather purse. At 32, she looked a decade older, her face weathered by 3 consecutive years of drought and the grueling, solitary labor of trying to save her late grandfather's fruit farm. Hayes' orchard was teetering on the edge of foreclosure. Her bank account held exactly $814. She had come to the auction with one desperate goal: to buy a used, functioning water pump to irrigate her dying fields before the final freeze. But Richard Gentry had other plans. Oid Gentry, a heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and a tailored tweed jacket that mocked the working-class room, owned Gentry Agribusiness. He controlled 60% of the valley's arable land, churning out flavorless, genetically modified strawberries for discount supermarket chains. Gentry didn't just want land, he wanted a monopoly. Lot 14, Dale Harmon, the auctioneer, droned into the microphone. 1 industrial diesel water pump. Opening bid, $300. Clara raised her numbered paddle. 300. Gentry, sitting in the front row, didn't even turn around. He casually lifted a thick finger. 500. Clara swallowed hard. 600. Gentry chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that carried through the silent hall. 800. Clara's heart sank into her boots. That was her entire safety net. If she bid 800, she wouldn't have enough left for the diesel fuel to run the pump. She lowered her paddle. Defeated, Gentry claimed the pump, adding it to the mountain of equipment he was hoarding simply to starve out the remaining independent farmers. Over the next hour, Clara watched as Gentry systematically bought up every piece of useful machinery, every stray acre of pasture. He was running up the bids, flexing his corporate muscle, making a spectacle of his dominance. Clara felt a hot sting of humiliation behind her eyes. She had failed. Her grandfather's legacy was going to rot in the fields. "All right, folks, moving on to the derelict properties," Dale Harmon announced, wiping sweat from his forehead. Lot 42, the old Miller Cannery on County Road 9, 2 acres of land, 1 commercial brick structure, heavily damaged by the '98 flood. Condemned status. The county is starting the bidding at $500, primarily for the value of the dirt underneath. A murmur of amusement rippled through the room. The Miller Cannery was a local eyesore. Its roof had partially caved in, its windows were jagged teeth of broken glass, and it was widely rumored to be structurally unsound. Gentry leaned back, whispering loudly to his foreman. "I'll give him 500. Need a place to park the new combine harvesters anyway. We can bulldoze that brick piece of trash by Friday." He raised his hand. 500. Clara stared at the floor, ready to walk out. But as Gentry spoke, a memory flashed in her mind. Her grandfather, sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, pointing his calloused finger toward the distant smokestack of the old cannery. "They don't make 'em like that anymore, Clara. Old man Miller went under, but he never compromised. He had solid copper, steam-jacketed preserving kettles imported from France. Weighed 2 tons each. When the bank locked the doors, the kettles stayed inside. Too heavy to steal, too embedded in the concrete to repossess." Clara's head snapped up. Commercial French copper kettles. If they were still in there, even covered in 30 years of grime, they were worth 10 times her bank account in scrap metal alone. If they were functional, They were priceless. "Do I hear 600?" the auctioneer called out, clearly expecting to gavel it to Gentry. Clara didn't think. Her arm shot up, the cardboard paddle cutting through the stifling air. 600. The room went dead silent. Heads swiveled. Even Gentry turned around, his thick brows furrowing in genuine confusion. He looked at Clara, taking in her scuffed work boots, her faded flannel shirt, and the desperate gleam in her eyes. "Well, well," Gentry sneered. Little Clara Hayes wants to play real estate developer. You gonna live in that rat trap when the bank takes your orchard next month?" The room chuckled. Gentry raised his hand. 700. Clara's knuckles turned white. 800. Every single dollar to her name. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. If Gentry bid 900, she was out. Gentry stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, a cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. He recognized a drowning woman tying an anchor around her own neck. Why waste his money when she was destroying herself for free? "Let her have it, Dale," Gentry called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's gonna need a sturdy brick wall to cry against when her farm goes under." The room erupted into laughter. The sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls, a harsh, jagged noise that burned Clara's ears. Going once, going twice. Sold to Clara Hayes for $800. The gavel slammed. The deed was done. Clara sat frozen as the laughter continued. She had just bought a condemned ruin, and she was entirely, utterly broke. But as she walked up to the clerk's desk to sign the cashier's check, her jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. Let them laugh. The next morning, an unseasonably cold fog clung to the Willamette Valley. Clara stood before the rusted, corrugated iron doors of the Miller Cannery. Up close, it looked even worse than it did from the road. The ivy had grown so thick it was slowly tearing the brick mortar apart, and the roof sagged ominously in the center. She retrieved a heavy pair of bolt cutters from her battered pickup truck and snapped the rusted padlock that had sealed the doors since 1998. With a grueling heave, she pushed the sliding doors along their seized tracks. The smell hit her instantly, a thick, suffocating wave of damp earth, pigeon guano, and the faint, ghostly sweetness of old sugar and vinegar. Clara clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the dense, floating dust motes. The interior was massive, a cathedral of forgotten industry. Shadows loomed in the corners, debris littered the cracked concrete floor, rotted wooden pallets, shattered glass jars, and tangles of old electrical wire. For a terrifying minute, Clara thought she had made the biggest mistake of her life. It was a wasteland. She picked her way carefully toward the center of the production floor, aiming her flashlight at a massive, tarp-covered mound rising from the concrete. Her breath hitched. She grabbed the edge of the stiff, brittle canvas tarp and pulled. It ripped, sending up a cloud of gray dust, but beneath it, the beam of her flashlight caught a dull, majestic gleam. There they were. Two massive, steam-jacketed copper kettles, easily holding 200 gallons each. They were tarnished, green with verdigris and spots, and covered in 30 years of filth, but they were perfectly intact. Clara ran her gloved hand along the thick, riveted lip of the nearest kettle. Her grandfather had been right. They were bolted directly into the foundation, plumbed into an ancient but heavy-duty cast-iron boiler system in the back room. Clara spent the next 2 weeks practically living in the cannery. She ignored the final warning letters from the bank. She ignored the pitying looks from the cashier at the local hardware store when she bought wire brushes, heavy-duty degreaser, and metal polish with her credit card, which was now dangerously close to maxed out. From dawn until midnight, she scrubbed. She hauled out buckets of debris. She learned how to dismantle the boiler's pressure valves, cleaning years of calcification out of the pipes. Her hands bled, her muscles screamed. But as the days passed, the copper began to shine. It glowed with a warm, fiery brilliance in the dim light of the cannery. It was during one of these exhaustive cleaning sessions, while sweeping out the old manager's office in the loft, that Clara found it. Tucked behind a warped filing cabinet was a small, leather-bound ledger. The cover was stiff with age. Clara blew the dust off and opened it. The handwriting inside was meticulous, written in faded blue fountain pen. It was Elias Miller's personal production log from the 1970s. Clara sat on an overturned milk crate and read by the beam of her flashlight. Miller wasn't just recording inventory, he had documented his proprietary preserving methods. As she read, Clara's eyes widened. Modern jams and preserves relied on commercial, synthetic pectin to force the fruit to gel quickly, allowing factories to pump out thousands of jars an hour. But it diluted the flavor, requiring massive amounts of cheap white sugar to compensate. Miller's method was entirely different. It was a slow, low-temperature reduction, using the immense thermal mass of the copper kettles, naturally extracting the fruit's own pectin over 16 hours. But the real secret was his acidulant instead of citric acid powder. Miller used the juice of unripe, wild green apples, which not only balanced the pH to ensure food safety, but imparted a crystal and vibrant brightness to the fruit that commercial operations simply couldn't replicate. Clara looked up from the book, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't just have equipment. She had a lost culinary art, but a cannery without fruit is just an empty building. Clara drove back to Hayes Orchard. The fields were a depressing sight. The drought had stunted the commercial strawberries, rendering them unsellable. But at the very back of the property, sheltered by a row of ancient windbreak pines, sat her grandfather's pride and joy. 2 acres of midnight rubies. Midnight rubies were a rare heirloom hybrid of blackberry and wild marionberry that her grandfather had cultivated. They were notoriously difficult to grow, yielding small, intensely dark fruit. Commercial buyers hated them because they were too delicate to survive cross-country shipping. Clara walked down the rows, tasting one. It exploded on her tongue, a complex, wine-like sweetness with a tart, earthy finish. It was the best berry in the world. She had 3 days before the fruit would over-ripen and rot on the vine. She had no hired hands, no money to pay them, and a rusted-out pickup truck. "All right," Clara whispered to the empty fields. "Let's go to work." For 72 hours, Clara operated on pure, frantic adrenaline. She picked the midnight rubies by hand, working through the blistering heat of the day and by the headlights of her truck at night. By Thursday evening, she had harvested 400 pounds of perfect, fragile fruit. She transported them to the cannery, where the real test began. She had spent the last of her credit limit on a cord of seasoned oak firewood and a pallet of glass mason jars. Firing the ancient boiler was terrifying. The cast iron groaned and popped as the heat expanded the metal. Clara watched the pressure gauge with bated breath, praying the 30-year-old seals would hold. Slowly, the needle crept into the green zone. Steam rushed into the jackets surrounding the copper kettles. Following Miller's ledger meticulously, Clara added the berries, the exact ratio of pure cane sugar, and the pressed juice from the wild green apples she had foraged from the forest edge. As the mixture began to heat, the magic happened. The copper kettles distributed the heat so evenly that the fruit didn't scorch. Instead, it melted into a deep, glossy, violet-black pool. The scent that began to waft from the cannery roof vents was intoxicating. It didn't smell like cooking jam. It smelled like the essence of late summer, a rich, floral, jammy perfume that drifted down County Road 9 and made passing drivers roll down their windows. Clara stood over the kettles for 16 grueling hours, skimming, stirring, and monitoring the temperature. When she finally pulled the release valve, the thick velvet preserves flowed into the sterile glass jars. She capped them, the metal lids pinging sharply as they vacuum sealed. 150 jars. It was a microscopic yield by industrial standards, but looking at the neat rows of glowing purple jars, Clara felt a surge of fierce, undeniable pride. Saturday morning was the Oak Haven Farmers Market. The town square was bustling. Richard Gentry's booth took up an entire corner of the market, a massive, professionally branded tent with a refrigerated truck dispensing flats of massive, watery, flavorless strawberries. Gentry himself stood at the front, shaking hands with the mayor, playing the benevolent king of the county. Clara set up a single, wobbly card table at the very edge of the market, near the portable toilets. She had no banner, no glossy brochures, just 50 jars of her midnight ruby preserves and a loaf of fresh sourdough bread cut into tasting cubes. She priced the jars at an unheard of $12 each. For the first hour, people walked right past her. $12 was absurd for a town accustomed to buying generic jam for $3 at the discount grocer. Then a wealthy-looking woman in a cashmere sweater, a tourist down from Portland for the weekend, stopped. She looked at the simple, handwritten label. "Midnight Ruby, what is that?" "It's an heirloom blackberry hybrid," Clara said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. "Grown locally, preserved in antique copper using a cold set method. Would you like a taste?" The woman shrugged indifferently and took a piece of bread smeared with the dark preserve. She put it in her mouth. Clara watched the woman's eyes widen. She stopped chewing for a second, a look of profound shock crossing her face. "My God," the woman whispered. I have never tasted anything like that in my entire life. It tastes like an actual blackberry, but concentrated. It's incredible." She reached into her designer purse. "I'll take 5 jars." The interaction didn't go unnoticed. The woman immediately walked over to her group of friends, urging them to taste it. Within 20 minutes, a line had formed at Clara's wobbly table. The scent and the vibrant, complex flavor were a revelation. People were buying 2, 3, 6 jars at a time. Clara's coffee tin cash box was overflowing with $20 bills. Across the square, Richard Gentry noticed the commotion. His own booth was suddenly empty, the locals abandoning his giant strawberries to see what the fuss was about. He narrowed his eyes, zeroing in on Clara, the girl who had bought the ruined cannery. Gentry pulled a cell phone from his tweed jacket and made a call. 5 minutes later, Tom Abernathy, the county health inspector, a man whose pockets had been lined by Gentry's campaign contributions for a decade, pushed his way through Clara's line. "Excuse me?" "Shut it down," Abernathy barked, flashing a badge. He picked up one of Clara's jars, sneering at the handwritten label. "Clara Hayes, are you producing this in a certified commercially inspected kitchen?" The crowd quieted, murmuring nervously. Gentry strolled up behind Abernathy, a smug, predatory grin on his face. "Well, Tom," Gentry drawled loudly, making sure the crowd could hear, "I happen to know Miss Hayes here bought that old rat-infested Miller place on Tuesday. There ain't no way that biohazard of a building passed a commercial health inspection in 3 days. She's selling unregulated, unsafe food to the public." Abernathy pulled out a pad of citation paper. "I'm confiscating this product and issuing a fine of $1,000 for operating without a commercial permit." "You're done, Clara." Clara felt the color drain from her face. The cash in her box wouldn't even cover the fine. Gentry had waited until she had hope just to crush it in front of the whole town. "You can't do that," Clara said, her voice shaking. "The jars are vacuum sealed. The acidity is perfectly balanced." "Doesn't matter," Abernathy said coldly. "No permit, no sales. Pack it up." Gentry leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "I told you, little girl, you're out of your league. Sell me your land on Monday, and maybe I'll pay off this fine for you." Clara looked at Gentry's smug face. She looked at the confiscated jar in Abernathy's hand, and then a slow, steely calm washed over her. She reached into her battered leather purse and pulled out a folded, yellowed legal document she had found tucked inside Miller's ledger. "Actually, Mr. Abernathy," Clara said, her voice ringing out clear and loud across the quiet market, "you might want to check County Ordinance 4A regarding grandfathered agricultural zoning." Abernathy paused, his pen hovering over the citation pad. What are you talking about? Clara unfolded the paper. Oh, when I bought the Miller Cannery deed from the county, it came with all original attached zoning rights. Because Elias Miller established the cannery in 1924, prior to the Willamette County Health and Safety Overhaul of 1956, the property holds a permanent, non-expiring agricultural processing exemption, provided the original equipment is still in use. She stared directly into Richard Gentry's eyes. I am using the original copper kettles. I am using the original boiler. By the county's own laws, my kitchen is permanently certified. If you try to confiscate my property, Mr. Abernathy, I will have the state attorney general down here by Monday morning to investigate targeted harassment. Abernathy looked at the old document, his face paling. He looked at Gentry, silently asking for instructions. Gentry's face had turned a deep, furious shade of red. The loophole was real, and he knew it. Gentry snatched the citation pad from Abernathy's hand, throwing it to the ground. He glared at Clara with pure, unadulterated hatred. This isn't over, Hayes. You think a fancy jar of jam is going to save your farm? I will crush you. He spun on his heel and stormed away. The crowd erupted into applause. Clara took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she handed the cashmere-clad tourist her change. She had won the battle, but looking at Gentry's retreating back, Clara knew the war for her grandfather's legacy had just begun. The victory at the farmer's market brought Clara a fleeting sense of security, but the harsh reality of her financial situation remained. The $1,200 she earned was swallowed immediately by the overdue property taxes, leaving her with exactly 42 cents. However, the whispers of her midnight ruby preserves had begun to ripple beyond the borders of Oakhaven. On a crisp Thursday afternoon, a sleek silver Mercedes sedan crawled down the potholed dirt driveway of Hayes Orchard. Out stepped David Arrington, a regional purchasing director for Whole Foods Market. He wore a sharp navy suit that seemed entirely out of place against the backdrop of Clara's dying fields. Arrington had attended a dinner party in Portland where a local socialite served Clara's preserves over artisanal cheese. One taste, and Arrington had driven 3 hours south to find the source. Clara met him on the porch, wiping grease from her hands onto a rag. She had been trying to fix the radiator on her grandfather's old tractor. Arrington did not mince words. He wanted to feature the Midnight Ruby preserves in a special Pacific Northwest Heritage promotion across 40 Whole Foods locations. He offered her a trial contract, 5,000 jars, to be delivered in exactly 4 weeks. The payment upon delivery would be $60,000. Clara's breath caught in her throat. $60,000 would pay off the bank, save the farm, and leave enough to fully restore the cannery. But 5,000 jars meant processing thousands of pounds of delicate fruit, requiring an army of pickers, industrial pallets of glass, and sugar. She had no capital to start. Arrington handed her a sleek business card, his expression sympathetic but firm. 4 weeks, Miss Hayes. If you can meet the deadline, you have a deal. If you miss it by a single day, the promotion moves to a honey farm in Seattle. As the Mercedes disappeared down the road, Clara realized the magnitude of her problem. She drove her rattling pickup truck to the Oakhaven Community Bank, hoping to secure a short-term agricultural bridge loan using the Whole Foods letter of intent as collateral. But Richard Gentry had already anticipated her moves. Gentry sat on the bank's board of directors. When Clara slid the letter across the desk to the loan officer, the man shook his head with genuine regret. I'm sorry, Clara. Board policy shifted this morning. We can no longer accept unfulfilled vendor contracts as collateral for high-risk properties. Clara knew exactly who had orchestrated the sudden policy shift. Gentry was systematically cutting off her oxygen. Desperate, Clara turned to the only people who despised Gentry as much as she did. The independent farmers he had driven into bankruptcy over the last decade. She called a secret meeting in the damp, cavernous space of the Miller Cannery. 8 weathered, broken men and women showed up, looking skeptically at the antique copper kettles. Clara stood on a wooden crate and laid out her plan. She offered them a stake. If they helped her pick the wild blackberries in the surrounding state forest and donated whatever cane sugar they had in their pantries, she would pay them triple the standard hourly wage the moment Whole Foods cut the check. It was a massive gamble, but these were people who had nothing left to lose. Sam Hodges, a dairy farmer who had lost his herd to Gentry's aggressive land grabs, stepped forward and spat into the dirt. "I've got 2 teenage boys in a flatbed truck. We pick at dawn." For the next 2 weeks, the cannery transformed into a beacon of rebellion. The ancient boiler roared day and night, consuming cords of scavenged wood. The sweet, intoxicating aroma of boiling fruit masked the smell of exhaust and sweat. Clara worked 20-hour shifts, stirring the massive kettles until her shoulders screamed in agony. They managed to process 2,000 jars. She was halfway there, but Gentry was not a man who tolerated defiance. On the 15th night, under the cover of a moonless sky, someone crept onto the cannery grounds. Clara had fallen asleep on a cot in the manager's office. She woke to the terrifying sound of shattering glass and the heavy scent of diesel fuel. She scrambled down the wooden stairs, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The main bay doors had been forced open. A figure clothed in black was frantically smashing her pallet of empty mason jars with a steel crowbar, preparing to douse the boxes in fuel. "Hey!" Clara screamed, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the boiler room. The intruder panicked, dropping the crowbar and sprinting into the night, leaving muddy boot prints on the concrete floor. Clara fell to her knees amidst the jagged glass. 3,000 empty jars, her entire remaining inventory, had been reduced to sparkling, useless shards. Without those jars, the Whole Foods contract was dead. There was no money to buy more, and no time to ship them, even if she had the funds. As the morning sun broke over the horizon, illuminating the devastation, Clara Hayes wept. Gentry had finally broken her. Or so he thought. As she swept the glass, a radical, dangerous idea began to form. She remembered something Elias Miller had written in the very back of his ledger. A contact, an old, glass-blowing facility located 2 hours north in Portland, a place that specialized in heavy, thick-walled apothecary jars during the 70s. If they were still operational, perhaps they had dead stock. Clara grabbed her keys, leaving the mess behind. She drove like a maniac, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She arrived at a dusty industrial park. The sign read, Olson Glassworks. Inside, a gruff man named Peter Olson listened to her desperate plea. He had thousands of discontinued, oddly shaped, vintage jars sitting in a warehouse, gathering dust. "Take them," Peter grunted, sliding her a bill of sale. "Pay me when you get rich." Clara finally had her precious jars. Returning to Oak Haven with a rented box truck loaded with vintage apothecary glass, Clara felt a surge of renewed adrenaline. The new jars were stunning. They possessed a weighty, luxurious feel that standard mason jars entirely lacked, elevating the rustic blackberry preserves into a premium culinary artifact. Sam Hodges and the rest of the rogue farming crew were already stoking the boiler when she backed into the loading dock. They worked in staggered shifts, sleeping on cots in the cold manager's office. The rhythm of the cannery became a relentless, mesmerizing dance of steam, pure sugar, and dark purple fruit. By the dawn of the final deadline day, the last vintage jar was sealed, wiped clean, and packed into heavy cardboard crates. Exactly 5,000 units sat on the concrete floor, waiting patiently for the Whole Foods freight truck. Clara's hands were blistered, her eyes bloodshot, but she was smiling. The sound of a heavy diesel engine approaching the cannery made her heart leap. However, it was not a refrigerated freight truck that pulled into the yard. It was a massive, Yellow County bulldozer, flanked by 2 Oak Haven sheriff cruisers and Richard Gentry's gleaming, black luxury pickup truck. Gentry stepped out, a victorious smirk plastered across his ruddy face. He walked up to the open bay doors, stopping just short of the stacked crates. "Morning, Clara," he drawled, now adjusting his tweed jacket. "Looks like you've been busy. Shame it's all for nothing." He snapped his fingers, and a deputy handed him a legal folder. "This building is officially condemned due to structural instability. I had a private engineer assess the exterior brickwork yesterday. It's a hazard. The county has ordered an immediate emergency demolition to prevent a collapse onto the public roadway. Evacuate the premises immediately." Clara stared at the demolition order in disbelief. Gentry had bribed a private engineer to fast-track a bogus structural report. The bulldozer roared to life, thick black smoke billowing from its exhaust pipe. "You cannot destroy my product," Clara shouted over the engine noise, standing defiantly in front of her crates. "I have a federally regulated commercial shipment arriving in exactly 2 hours." Gentry laughed, a cruel, booming sound. "You have 10 minutes to clear out, little girl. Once that blade hits the front wall, everything inside becomes rubble, including your precious little jars of overpriced, useless wild berry jam." Panic seized the crew. Sam Hodges grabbed a tire iron, ready to fight the deputies, but Clara held up her hand. Fighting the law would only land them in jail. She needed a miracle. Suddenly, her eyes darted to the muddy boot prints still permanently stained on the concrete floor from the saboteur. They matched the very distinctive tread of Gentry's custom-made leather cowboy boots perfectly. Clara grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the one number she had saved for absolute emergencies. She had found it in her grandfather's desk. It belonged to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, regional director. As the bulldozer shifted into drive, creeping toward the fragile brick wall, a sleek black government SUV came speeding down County Road 9, sirens blaring. It swerved into the dirt lot, cutting off the bulldozer. A stern woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out, holding a federal injunction. "Cut the engine," she commanded, flashing an official badge at the bewildered deputies. "This entire property has just been granted temporary federal protection under the Historical Industrial Heritage Act. Any unauthorized demolition of these original copper-smelting kettles is a federal crime, punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison." Gentry's face turned entirely purple with rage. "This is a local county zoning matter," he spat, stepping toward the federal agent. "You have no jurisdiction here." The agent smiled coldly, pulling out her tablet. "Actually, Mr. Gentry, Miss Hayes filed an emergency preservation petition 30 minutes ago citing the unique metallurgical composition of the kettles. Furthermore, we will be opening a formal investigation into the attempted arson that occurred here, starting with matching those boot prints to your footwear." Gentry froze, his eyes dropping to his boots. He knew he was trapped. He turned and stormed back to his truck. The deputies quickly dispersed, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal arson investigation. The bulldozer operator hastily reversed his machine and drove away, leaving Clara standing victorious in the settling dust. 10 minutes later, the massive refrigerated Whole Foods freight truck finally arrived, backing smoothly up to the loading dock. The driver lowered the ramp, looking impressed by the mountain of beautifully packed vintage glass jars. Sam Hodges and the crew cheered loudly, immediately forming a human chain to load the pallets. Clara watched the first box disappear into the dark truck, feeling a profound sense of overwhelming, pure relief. When David Arrington arrived an hour later to inspect the final shipment and sign off on the delivery, he was astounded. He picked up one of the heavy, thick-walled vintage apothecary jars, holding it up to the morning sunlight. The preserves glowed like liquid garnets. "I thought you would use standard packaging," Arrington murmured, thoroughly impressed. "This presentation is extraordinary, Clara. It tells a complete story. We are going to retail these for $25 a jar, and they will sell out completely in 3 days." He pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his suit pocket and wrote the payment. Clara held the check for $60,000 in her trembling hands. It was enough to save Hayes Orchard, upgrade the cannery, and pay her loyal crew triple their promised wages. She looked around the cavernous, echoing room of the old Miller cannery. The copper kettles gleamed brightly in the shadows, humming softly with residual heat. The town had laughed at her $800 bid. but she had turned ruins into gold. This was no longer just a desperate attempt to survive the winter. It was the birth of a culinary empire, and Richard Gentry was powerless to stop her now. When the initial launch of the Midnight Ruby preserves hit the Pacific Northwest region of Whole Foods, it was nothing short of a culinary phenomenon. David Arrington's prediction of a 3-day sellout proved to be woefully conservative. The entire 5,000-jar inventory vanished from the meticulously arranged end cap displays in exactly 14 hours. A prominent Seattle food critic, Thomas Keller, happened to purchase a jar for his Sunday morning toast. By Monday afternoon, his glowing review in the Regional Culinary Gazette had gone viral, describing Clara's preserves as a visceral, explosive return to genuine agricultural artistry. The vintage apothecary glass jars became an instant status symbol on the granite countertops of wealthy tech executives and suburban food enthusiasts alike. Back in Oak Haven, the immediate influx of the $60,000 payment transformed Hayes' orchard. Clara Hayes marched into the Oak Haven Community Bank on a Tuesday morning, bypassing the loan officer completely, and dropped a certified cashier's check on the branch manager's desk. She paid the property taxes in full, cleared the delinquent mortgage balance, and officially secured her grandfather's land. The look of profound disappointment on the bank manager's face, knowing Richard Gentry's master plan had failed, was a sweet, silent victory. Clara kept her promise to the rogue farming crew, Sam Hodges and the other independent growers who had risked everything to help her meet the deadline, received envelopes stuffed with crisp, triple-wage cash. For the first time in 3 brutal years, the shadow of foreclosure lifted from the valley's smaller homesteads. The Miller Cannery was officially brought up to code, the ancient French copper kettles polished until they resembled glowing embers. But the quiet peace of the Willamette Valley was shattered precisely 3 weeks later. David Arrington returned to the cannery, this time accompanied by a senior vice president of national purchasing for Whole Foods. They sat on overturned wooden crates in Clara's newly swept office, reviewing a massive binder of sales metrics. "We want to take Midnight Ruby national," the vice president announced, leaning forward with predatory enthusiasm. "Every single flagship store from Austin to Boston, but we cannot work with a micro-batch supply chain. We need guaranteed volume. We are offering a 2-year exclusive vendor contract, Clara, but the initial order is 50,000 jars per month, starting in exactly 90 days. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. 50,000 jars. It was a staggering, life-altering volume. At $25 retail, the gross revenue would make her a millionaire before the year was out. But the sheer logistical terror of the request immediately suffocated her excitement. "I cannot fulfill that," Clara said flatly, the truth tasting bitter on her tongue. "The Midnight Ruby Blackberry is a delicate, temperamental heirloom hybrid. My grandfather cultivated exactly 2 acres. Even if I plant new vines tomorrow, it takes 3 full growing seasons for a mature yield. I physically do not possess the fruit to produce 50,000 jars." Arrington frowned, tapping his expensive pen against the clipboard. "Then you need to buy more land and secure existing crops, or compromise the recipe with a commercial blackberry blend. Clara, if you cannot meet this volume, corporate will rescind the offer and give the shelf space to a synthetic competitor. You have 48 hours to sign the intent to supply." As the executive's silver rental car vanished down the dirt road, Clara felt the familiar, crushing weight of impossibility. To meet the quota, she needed mature, fruit-bearing land. And in Oak Haven County, there was only one man who controlled the available agricultural acreage. Before Clara could even formulate a desperate plan, a sleek, black Lincoln Town car pulled into the cannery yard the following afternoon. Out stepped Preston Cole, a senior acquisition partner for Apex Capital Group, a ruthless private equity firm based in Chicago. Cole was a man whose expensive cologne and tailored Italian suit masked a deeply predatory nature. He walked into the cannery without knocking, his eyes scanning the antique equipment with a cold, calculating assessment. "Miss Hayes," Cole said smoothly, extending a manicured hand that Clara deliberately ignored. Apex Capital has been monitoring your remarkable little success story. Oh, B, we specialize in acquiring boutique culinary brands and scaling them for mass market distribution. We are prepared to offer you $2.5 million for the Hayes Orchard brand, the Miller Cannery, and the proprietary recipe ledger in your possession. Clara stared at him, her jaw tight. $2.5 million. And what happens to the preserves? Cole chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. We automate, we replace these ridiculously inefficient copper kettles with stainless steel continuous flow vats. We swap the wild green apple juice for synthetic, laboratory-grade pectin, and we use a generic, high-yield blackberry concentrate imported from South America. We keep the fancy glass jar and the artisanal label. The consumer never knows the difference, and our profit margins increase by 400%. You want to destroy everything my grandfather built just to sell cheap syrup in a pretty bottle, Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I want to make you a millionaire, Miss Hayes, Cole countered smoothly. But I should warn you, if you decline, Apex Capital will enter the market anyway. We will reverse engineer a close approximation of your flavor profile, undercut your retail price by half, and flood the supermarket aisles. Furthermore, I had a very interesting breakfast this morning with a local businessman named Richard Gentry. He informed me of your current communist supply chain limitations. We are well aware you cannot meet the Whole Foods quota. Sell to us now, before you lose the contract and return to bankruptcy. Clara stood up, her boots echoing loudly on the concrete floor. She walked over to the heavy iron bay doors and slid them open, gesturing toward the dirt driveway. Get off my property, Mr. Cole. My legacy is not for sale. Cole's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of corporate hostility. You just made a very expensive mistake, Clara. Gentry is going to starve you out, and I am going to buy this cannery for pennies at the next foreclosure auction. As Cole drove away, Clara knew the stakes had just escalated, from a local rivalry to a corporate war. She had 48 hours to secure enough fruit to produce 50,000 jars, and she was entirely surrounded by enemies. The morning after Preston Cole's ultimatum, the coordinated squeeze began with brutal efficiency. Clara arrived at the cannery to find a certified letter taped to the door. It was from Peter Olson, the gruff glassblower in Portland, who had supplied the vintage apothecary jars. The letter was short and devastating. Apex Capital bought the warehouse. All remaining inventory is locked. I'm sorry, kid. 30 minutes later, Clara's bulk supplier for pure cane sugar called to abruptly cancel her account, citing a mysterious, sudden, exclusive distribution agreement signed with Gentry Agribusiness. Richard Gentry and Apex Capital were systematically dismantling her supply chain, attempting to force her into defaulting on the Whole Foods contract before she even signed it. Clara sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the grandfather clock ticking relentlessly on the wall. She was out of glass, out of sugar, and critically short on fruit. The logical, sensible choice was to call David Arrington, surrender the national contract, and go back to selling small batches at the local farmers market. But Clara Hayes was not built for surrender. She inherited her grandfather's stubborn, unbreakable spine. She picked up her phone and called Sam Hodges. Sam, get the crew together. I need everyone at the cannery in 1 hour. Bring every independent farmer who still has a pulse in this valley. By noon, the cannery floor was packed. Over 30 local farmers, ranchers, and orchardists stood among the copper kettles, their faces lined with years of weather and worry. They murmured nervously, waiting for Clara to speak. She climbed onto the highest pallet, silencing the crowd. Richard Gentry and a Chicago hedge fund are trying to choke us out. Clara projected her voice, letting the raw anger bleed into her words. They bought my glass supply. They blocked my sugar. They think because they control the commercial pipelines, they control Oak Haven, but they forgot one crucial detail. They only control the commercial crops. They don't control the wildlands, and they don't control the heritage orchards. Clara pulled out Elias Miller's worn leather ledger, holding it high. This book doesn't just contain the recipe for midnight ruby blackberries. Miller was a master preservationist. He documented cold-set pectin extraction for wild mountain plums, Bartlett pears, and foraged elderberries. Whole Foods wants 50,000 jars of artisanal preserves. We are going to give them a complete Pacific Northwest heritage collection. She pointed at Martha Higgins, an elderly woman who owned a sprawling, overgrown 50-acre tract bordering the state park. Martha, you have hundreds of wild plum trees rotting on your back acreage every August because commercial buyers say they're too tart. Martha nodded slowly. They make your mouth pucker raw, Clara. Not when they hit these copper kettles, Clara countered. She turned to a towering man named Bill Tench. Bill, your grandfather planted an entire orchard of red Bartlett pears in the 50s. Gentry refused to buy them last year because their skins were too fragile for the sorting machines. They're just sitting there, dropping to the ground, Bill muttered, rubbing his jaw. Not anymore, Clara declared. We are forming a legal agricultural cooperative, the Oak Haven Heritage Collective. You provide the forgotten fruit. I provide the facility and the Whole Foods contract. We split the profits evenly, bypassing the commercial commodity markets entirely. A shock wave of whispered excitement rippled through the crowd. This was a rebellion against the corporate agribusiness model that had slowly strangled their town. But what about the glass? Sam Hodges asked, crossing his thick arms. You said Apex bought out your supplier. Clara smiled, a sharp, cunning expression. Apex bought the warehouse in Portland, but my grandfather kept meticulous records. I spent the entire night calling independent glass foundries across the country. I found a family-owned manufacturer in rural Ohio that still possesses the original iron molds for the 1920s apothecary jars. They are desperate for a large-scale contract. If we wire them a deposit today, they will run their kilns 24 hours a day and freight ship 60,000 jars directly to this dock. And the sugar, another farmer called out. We don't need refined cane sugar, Clara replied, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. We live in the Pacific Northwest. I struck a deal this morning with an independent apiary collective in the Cascade Mountains. We are replacing the white sugar with raw, unpasteurized blackberry honey. It elevates the flavor profile, balances the wild fruit acidulant, and completely circumvents Gentry's supply blockade. The room erupted. The independent farmers of Oak Haven, battered and bruised by years of corporate bullying, finally had a weapon. They lined up to sign the hastily drafted cooperative agreement, pledging their labor, their tractors, and their forgotten harvests. For the next 89 days, the valley transformed. A massive fleet of rusted pickup trucks, tractors, and horse trailers mobilized, harvesting thousands of pounds of wild plums, fragile heirloom pears, and the precious midnight ruby blackberries. The cannery became an unstoppable engine of industry. The Ohio glass jars arrived by the truckload, and 500-gallon drums of golden, raw mountain honey were unloaded onto the docks. Clara orchestrated the chaos with military precision. The copper kettles boiled continuously, operated by rotating shifts of dedicated farmers. The scent of wild plum and honey drifted over Oak Haven, a sweet, defiant perfume that reached all the way to Richard Gentry's sterile corporate office. Gentry attempted one final, desperate maneuver. He sent his lawyers to file an emergency injunction, claiming the heavy truck traffic on County Road 9 was damaging the municipal asphalt, demanding a halt to the collective's operations. But when the county judge reviewed the petition, he found himself staring down a courtroom packed with 40 angry, tax-paying local farmers, heavily backed by Whole Foods' corporate legal team, who had flown in from Texas specifically to protect their investment. The judge threw Gentry's petition out with a stern warning against frivolous litigation. On the morning of the 90th day, a convoy of 5 massive 18-wheeler trucks, bearing the Whole Foods logo, lined up along the dirt road leading to the Miller Cannery. Inside the facility sat 50,000 breathtaking jars of premium heritage preserves. There were rows of dark, velvet midnight rubies, glowing amber wild plums, and golden, spiced Bartlett pears. David Arrington walked down the line, inspecting the pallets. He tasted the wild plum, sweetened with raw mountain honey, closing his eyes as the complex, vibrant flavors exploded on his palate. He turned to Clara, who was leaning against a copper kettle covered in a thin layer of powdered sugar and exhaustion. "You didn't just meet the quota, Clara," Arrington said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "You completely reinvented the category. Apex Capital is going to be furious. They'll never be able to replicate this." Clara watched as the forklifts began loading the pallets into the trucks. She looked out over the yard, seeing Sam Hodges laughing with Bill Tench, watching the farmers of Oak Haven reclaim their dignity and their livelihoods. "Let them be furious," Clara said softly, untying her stained apron. They can buy the land, and they can buy the warehouses, but they can't buy the soul of this valley, and they definitely can't buy my grandfather's kettles." As the trucks roared out of Oak Haven, destined for supermarket shelves across the nation, Clara Hayes finally allowed herself to rest. The condemned $800 ruin was now the beating heart of a multi-million-dollar agricultural revolution. The laughter in the auction room had long since faded, replaced entirely by the unstoppable, roaring machinery of success. The success of the Oak Haven Heritage Collective was swift, staggering, and completely undeniable. Within 6 months of securing the exclusive national contract, the rollout across Whole Foods locations generated over $8 million in gross revenue. The small, overlooked town of Oak Haven, which had been slowly dying under the monopolistic, suffocating grip of gentry agribusiness, suddenly experienced a stunning, vibrant renaissance. Main Street storefronts that had been boarded up and abandoned for a decade suddenly reopened with fresh coats of paint. Sam Hodges purchased a brand-new fleet of heavy-duty dairy trucks, and Martha Higgins fully restored her family's historic, sprawling farmhouse. Clara Hayes, the desperate woman who had gambled her absolute last $800 on a condemned, rat-infested brick building, was now the chief executive officer of a thriving, highly respected agricultural empire. Yet Richard Gentry and Preston Cole of Apex Capital were not the type of men who simply accepted defeat gracefully. As the lucrative holiday season rapidly approached, Whole Foods placed their largest, most ambitious order yet, exactly 100,000 jars of one limited edition spiced winter blackberry preserve, intended specifically for the premium front-facing displays of every single flagship store in America. The logistical pressure inside the Miller Cannery was immense, heavy, and constant. Clara was forced to hire 30 additional seasonal agricultural workers just to keep the massive antique copper kettles boiling steadily around the clock. The air inside the factory was a perpetual, thick fog of sweet steam and intense grinding labor. Amidst this chaotic, steaming hustle of the sprawling production floor, a brand-new seasonal hire named Thomas Weaver quietly and efficiently blended into the background. He was a deliberately quiet, incredibly unassuming man who convincingly claimed to be a displaced, struggling farmhand from exactly 2 counties over. In harsh reality, however, he was a highly trained corporate espionage operative planted directly on Apex Capital's secretive payroll. His primary objective was not to foolishly attempt to steal Elias Miller's proprietary recipe, but rather to destroy the Oak Haven brand permanently from the inside out. The executives at Apex Capital thoroughly knew they could never mathematically beat Clara in the open free market, so they ruthlessly planned to orchestrate a catastrophic, highly publicized national scandal. On a bitterly frigid Tuesday evening, while the exhausted night shift was taking their strictly mandated meal break, Weaver stealthily slipped into the main, temperature-controlled storage room. This was where the massive stainless steel holding vats of freshly pressed, raw, wild blackberry juice were securely kept before the rigorous boiling process. He nervously pulled a small, entirely unmarked plastic dropper bottle from the deep pocket of his heavy, insulated winter coat. The tiny vial contained a highly concentrated, incredibly potent synthetic commercial pesticide, a dangerous chemical compound strictly banned by all organic grocers and completely toxic to humans in large, unheated doses. A mere 10 drops directly into the primary juice vats would easily survive the intense heat of the boiling process, thoroughly contaminating the entire massive holiday batch. When the independent quality assurance laboratories at Whole Foods inevitably tested the arriving shipment, the federal FDA would instantly issue a catastrophic, mandatory national recall. The beloved Oak Haven Heritage Collective would instantly be branded as a severe public health hazard, sued into absolute oblivion by federal regulators, and completely liquidated in bankruptcy court. Weaver carefully unscrewed the tight plastic cap and moved swiftly toward the largest primary holding vat. But he had fundamentally, tragically underestimated the obsessive, highly meticulous, and fiercely protective nature of Clara Hayes. Clara was currently up in the elevated manager's loft, exhaustively poring over the fragile pages of Elias Miller's original leather-bound ledger. She was intensely reviewing a highly specific, complicated chapter regarding organic pH balancing when the ancient wooden floorboards below her creaked ominously. She casually glanced out the dusty loft window that perfectly overlooked the dimly lit storage room. Through the heavily frosted glass, she distinctly saw a dark, creeping shadow standing suspiciously over her precious juice vats. A sudden, freezing spike of pure adrenaline sharply pierced her deep exhaustion. She didn't recklessly shout or alert the intruder. Instead, she silently grabbed a heavy, solid cast-iron pipe wrench from the bottom desk drawer and quietly, swiftly slipped down the narrow back wooden staircase, stepping perfectly to avoid the known squeaking steps. Weaver was just tipping the deadly chemical bottle dangerously over the open vat when the heavy, reinforced iron doors of the storage room suddenly slammed completely shut with a deafening, echoing clang. He violently spun around in pure shock to see Clara standing directly under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, the massive cast-iron wrench visibly gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand. "I strongly suggest you step away from that fat," Clara stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy, and remarkably calm register. Weaver panicked instantly. He desperately tried to dump the remaining contents into the juice, but Clara lunged forward with explosive speed, swinging the heavy iron wrench in a wide, vicious, precise arc. It violently smashed directly into Weaver's extended wrist, sending the small plastic bottle flying violently across the hard concrete floor. It shattered instantly upon impact, immediately spilling a foul, acrid, chemical-smelling liquid that burned the nostrils. Weaver desperately scrambled backward, loudly cursing and clutching his deeply bruised arm, his terrified eyes rapidly darting toward the locked emergency exit. "Sam!" Clara roared loudly, her powerful voice echoing endlessly through the cavernous, brick-lined cannery. "Lock down the main loading docks right now." Within mere seconds, Sam Hodges and 3 massive, burly orchardists violently burst through the side heavy wooden doors, aggressively surrounding the completely terrified corporate operative. Clara slowly knelt down, carefully inspecting the violently spilled liquid without touching it. The pungent, completely artificial, intensely toxic odor was completely unmistakable to anyone who knew organic farming. It was a highly targeted, incredibly vicious chemical sabotage attempt. "You have exactly 1 minute to loudly and clearly tell me exactly who is currently signing your corporate paychecks," Clara aggressively demanded, stepping menacingly closer toward Weaver. "Or Sam here is going to accidentally, tragically drop you into a boiling 200-gallon copper kettle." Weaver, trembling violently and sweating profusely, despite the freezing ambient temperature, immediately, completely broke down. He rapidly confessed to absolutely everything. The massive secret cash payoffs directly from Preston Cole, the highly coordinated, malicious logistics carefully planned with Richard Gentry, and the specific, step-by-step plan to intentionally trigger a massive FDA federal intervention. Clara swiftly pulled out her smartphone and hit the record button, digitally capturing every single, damning word of the elaborate corporate conspiracy. The devastating trap viciously meant for her complete destruction had just miraculously become a powerfully devastating weapon against her worst corporate enemies. Clara instructed Sam to immediately bind Weaver's hands with heavy industrial zip ties and promptly dialed the state police division located an hour north in Portland. The war was turning. The resulting legal fallout from Thomas Weaver's fully recorded, incredibly detailed confession was remarkably immediate, utterly catastrophic, and completely, embarrassingly public. By very early Thursday morning, heavily armed federal authorities aggressively raided the sleek, glass-paneled downtown Chicago headquarters of Apex Capital. They systematically seized physical servers, confiscated encrypted hard drives, and immediately froze billions in corporate assets under severe suspicion of corporate sabotage, food supply tampering, and severe interstate commerce violations. Preston Cole was publicly, humiliatingly escorted out of his massive glass high-rise lobby in heavy steel handcuffs, his ridiculously expensive, tailored Italian suit suddenly looking remarkably pathetic on the heavily syndicated evening news broadcasts. Furthermore, Whole Foods' aggressive corporate legal team ruthlessly filed a massive 9-figure civil injunction against both Apex Capital and Gentry Agribusiness for attempted malicious brand defamation and illegal tortious interference. But the absolutely most spectacular, earth-shattering collapse naturally happened right inside the city limits of Oakhaven. Richard Gentry, the tyrannical, ruthless agricultural baron who had maliciously suffocated the beautiful valley for 3 decades, suddenly found his massive, sprawling empire completely, irreparably paralyzed. Meticulous state investigators completely froze all of Gentry's operational banking accounts, strictly pending the upcoming federal conspiracy trial. Without any immediate access to his previously vast capital reserves, Gentry absolutely could not purchase necessary diesel fuel for his massive fleet of combine harvesters. He could not financially pay his massive seasonal labor force. Most importantly, he absolutely could not mathematically make the staggering multi-million-dollar balloon payment currently due on the highly aggressive, predatory land loans he had maliciously taken out to forcefully buy up the valley's independent farms over the last 10 brutal years. Within exactly 45 agonizing days, the Oakhaven Community Bank, the very same local institution that had once cruelly denied Clara a simple, life-saving bridge loan strictly at Gentry's explicit behest, was legally, ironically, forced to aggressively initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on the entirety of Gentry Agribusiness. It was a perfectly poetic, incredibly brutal, and thoroughly satisfying reversal of cosmic fate. On a remarkably bright, beautifully unseasonably warm Tuesday morning in late March, the heavy, scarred oak gavel of the Oakhaven Town Hall officially prepared to strike the sounding block once more. It was exactly 18 months since a desperate Clara Hayes had nervously sat in the third row and blindly purchased the ruined Miller Cannery for exactly $800. Today, however, the large room was completely packed to absolute, standing room-only capacity. But the general atmosphere was entirely, wonderfully different. There was absolutely no mocking, cruel laughter echoing off the walls. There was only a deeply hushed, incredibly reverent silence filling the tense air. Dale Harmon, the exact same sweating auctioneer who had previously publicly mocked Clara's desperate financial situation, nervously cleared his dry throat loudly into the feedback-heavy microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are formally gathered here today to officially auction the completely seized agricultural assets of Gentry Agribusiness. Lot number 1, exactly 6,000 acres of prime, highly irrigated Willamette Valley farmland, entirely including the primary industrial processing facility. 14 commercial harvesters, and all legally attached municipal water rights. The holding bank strictly requires a minimum opening bid of exactly $4.2 million. Richard Gentry quietly sat in the very front row, a thoroughly broken, completely defeated shell of a man. His previously ruddy, confident complexion had entirely faded to a sickly, pale gray, and his signature tailored tweed jacket now hung incredibly loosely on his rapidly shrinking, defeated frame. He blankly stared directly at the scuffed wooden floorboards, entirely refusing to make any eye contact with the dozens of independent, hard-working farmers he had previously maliciously bankrupted, who now proudly, defiantly, lined the walls of the packed courthouse. Clara Hayes sat comfortably in the very back row, proudly flanked by her loyal friends Sam Hodges, Martha Higgins, and Bill Tench. She was absolutely no longer wearing heavily scuffed work boots and a torn, faded flannel shirt, though her strong hands still proudly bore the permanent calluses of extremely hard, honest labor. She elegantly wore a sharp, highly tailored black blazer, officially representing the wildly successful Oak Haven Heritage Collective as its unanimously elected president. The cooperative's massive bank accounts, currently flush from 2 incredible years of explosive national retail sales and the incredibly massive punitive damage settlement recently paid out by the disgraced Apex Capital, confidently held more than enough liquid capital. "Do I currently hear $4.2 million? Dale Harmon cautiously asked, nervously scanning the completely silent, highly expectant room. Clara smoothly, confidently raised her numbered bidding paddle high into the air. $5 million. The collective, stunned gasp loudly echoing in the historic room was remarkably audible. Clara wasn't just simply meeting the bank's minimum requirement. She was aggressively publicly asserting total, absolute dominance over the situation. She was literally buying back the entire beautiful valley in one single, undeniable, incredibly powerful financial stroke. Gentry finally, slowly turned around in his creaking wooden chair. He weakly looked directly at Clara, his heavily bagged eyes wide with a complex mixture of profound shock and deep, agonizing humiliation. The young, desperate woman he had maliciously tried to completely crush, the poor girl he had loudly, publicly laughed at, was now casually, effortlessly, writing a massive check to completely dismantle his entire life's ruthless work. $5 million is officially bid. Harmon stammered loudly, clearly completely stunned by the massive jump. Going once, going twice, officially sold to the Oak Haven Heritage Collective for exactly $5 million. The heavy gavel slammed down hard. The sharp sound loudly echoed through the quiet courthouse, absolutely not as a depressing symbol of tragedy, but strictly as a thunderous, beautiful ring of absolute, undeniable liberation. The dozens of farmers in the packed room immediately erupted into a truly deafening, wildly emotional standing ovation, loudly cheering and joyfully throwing their worn canvas hats high into the dusty air. Sam Hodges tightly clapped Clara on the shoulder, warm tears of pure joy streaming rapidly down his deeply weathered, smiling face. The immediate aftermath of the historic auction fundamentally transformed the entire geography of Oak Haven County. Clara and the collective immediately, aggressively tore up the incredibly sterile, genetically modified, entirely flavorless strawberry fields that Gentry had selfishly planted. They systematically, lovingly returned the rich land to its natural, beautiful, wild state, carefully planting massive, sprawling groves of delicate heirloom red Bartlett pears, expansive, winding fields of the incredible midnight ruby blackberries, and incredibly dense, vibrant thickets of tart mountain plums. They efficiently converted Gentry's previously sterile cold processing plant into a highly advanced, state-of-the-art logistics and shipping hub, perfectly ensuring the historic Miller Cannery could solely focus on the incredibly delicate, highly artisanal copper kettle boiling process that had originally made them all famous. One beautifully quiet Sunday evening, long after the dedicated harvest crews had happily gone home to their families, Clara stood completely alone in the center of the original Miller Cannery. The massive, heavy French copper kettles hummed softly, with residual, comforting warmth, beautifully radiating a deep golden glow in the dim, peaceful twilight. She gently ran her calloused hand along the heavily riveted lip of the nearest massive vat, deeply feeling the solid, completely immovable history vibrating beneath her sensitive fingertips. She had bravely risked her absolute last $800 on a rusted, condemned ruin, strictly because she fiercely believed in the forgotten, incredible value of honest, highly meticulous labor. She had successfully fought off massive corporate sabotage, deeply corrupt local inspectors, and a truly ruthless agricultural monopoly. Powerfully armed with absolutely nothing but her beloved grandfather's timeless wisdom and a profound, unshakable respect for the living land. As the incredibly sweet, intensely earthy scent of deeply boiling blackberries slowly drifted out into the cool, refreshing Oregon night air, Clara finally smiled broadly. The long, difficult harvest was finally permanently secure. Loved this incredible story of resilience and triumph? Don't forget to absolutely hit that like button. Share this inspiring video with anyone who truly loves an amazing underdog victory against corporate greed, and passionately subscribe to the channel today. Make absolutely sure you ring that notification bell so you never miss another thrilling entrepreneurial journey. We want to hear from you. What was your absolute favorite twist in Clara's battle against Gentry? Drop a fiery comment down below right now. Join our amazing community, and we will definitely see you in the very next storytelling video.